The cabin clung to the mountainside like a stubborn barnacle, weathered gray against the deep greens and blues of the Appalachian expanse. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, stale coffee, and the quiet desperation of a man marooned by his own history. Retired Colonel Jackson, Stonewall Davies sat in a worn leather armchair, his gaze fixed on the empty fireplace. For 20 years, the fire had been out. He was a national hero, a living legend whose story was etched into the hallowed halls of military academies, a testament to courage under fire. His face, now a roadmap of deep-set lines and solemn regret, had once been on the cover of magazines. They called him the Lion of Karangal, the man who, in a maelstrom of dust and terror, had saved his entire platoon. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor, rested on the stone mantelpiece, its blue ribbon a stark slash of color in the monochromatic gloom. To everyone else, it was a symbol of ultimate sacrifice. To Jackson, it was a brand, a daily reminder of the deafening lie that had become his life's foundation. He hadn't touched it in years, but he could feel its weight from across the room, heavier than any rucksack, more suffocating than any bunker. The world saw a hero. He knew the hollowed-out shell of a man who had stolen another's glory. He was not a lion. He was a tomb, guarding the bones of a truth that should have been shouted from the mountaintops but was instead buried under the suffocating soil of duty, honor, and a terrible, misguided promise. The silence of the mountain was his only companion, a silence that did nothing to quiet the ghosts of that day. The gravel crunching on his long, untended driveway was an alien sound, a violation of the sanctum he had built to contain his guilt. He rose, his movements stiff, his body aching with a weariness that had nothing to do with age. Through the window, he saw a modest sedan, its engines sighing to a halt. A woman and a young girl emerged, their figures small and uncertain against the vast, indifferent wilderness. They were the first visitors he'd had in over a year, and an icy dread, cold and familiar, coiled in his gut. He knew, with the chilling certainty of a soldier sensing an ambush, that they were not here by accident. They were here for the truth. The heavy oak door opened with a groan, revealing Jackson Davies in the flesh. He was taller than the photographs suggested, but stooped, as if carrying an invisible burden. His eyes, the same piercing blue that had once inspired men to follow him into hell, were now clouded and distant. He looked at the woman and the girl on his porch, his expression a formidable wall of dismissal. The woman, Sarah Thorne, clutched her handbag with white knuckles, her face a mixture of resolve and trepidation. Beside her, her daughter Lily, a girl of about 10 with wide, serious eyes, held her mother's hand. "Colonel Davies?" Sarah's voice was steady, but it trembled at the edges. Jackson merely nodded, his jaw tight. He offered no welcome, no invitation to step inside. The mountain wind whipped around them, cold and sharp. "My name is Sarah Thorne. This is my daughter Lily." He did not react, but an almost imperceptible flicker in his eyes betrayed him. The name Thorne was a key, one that unlocked a door in his memory he kept bolted shut. "We won't take much of your time, sir," Sarah continued, sensing his resistance. We just needed to ask you something. About my husband. Sergeant Michael Thorne." Jackson's face remained a mask of stone, but inside, the carefully constructed dam of 2 decades began to crack. Sergeant Thorne. The quiet one. The one they called a coward. The one whose memory he had desecrated with his silence. "The official report is public record, ma'am," he said, his voice a low gravelly rumble. It was his standard line, the one he used to deflect the rare reporter who still sought him out. "There's nothing I can add. With all due respect, sir, the report is why we're here." Sarah pressed, her courage growing. "It says my husband failed in his duty. It says he froze. It's followed us our whole lives. It's all she's ever known of her father." She gestured to Lily, whose gaze never left the colonel's face. The girl wasn't looking at a hero. She was looking at the man who held the missing piece of her life. Jackson felt a profound urge to slam the door, to retreat back into the comfortable misery of his self-imposed exile. But he couldn't. Not with the child's eyes on him. They were Michael's eyes. Sarah Thorne was not an accuser. Her demeanor was one of a seeker, a pilgrim who had journeyed to the end of the earth for a single, defining answer. Jackson finally, reluctantly, gestured for them to come inside. The cabin was sparse, masculine, and achingly clean, as if order and discipline were the only things holding the man together. The Medal of Honor on the mantel seemed to pull all the light in the room toward it, a tiny, brilliant star of unbearable density. Sarah and Lily sat on the edge of a stiff sofa, while Jackson remained standing, a sentinel in his own home. He did not offer them a drink. He did not ask them to take off their coats. He wanted this over. For 20 years, Sarah began, her voice gaining strength in the warmth of the room, I've tried to reconcile the man I married with the soldier in that report. They aren't the same person. Michael wasn't a hero, maybe, but he wasn't a coward. He was a good man. He loved his platoon. He loved his country. And he loved us. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a letter, its pages yellowed and creased, the ink faded by time and tears. He wrote this the night before the ambush. It arrived 2 weeks after we were notified. Jackson watched the letter as if it were a live explosive. He knew what it was. It was a ghost, a voice from the grave, and it had come to call him to account. He knew he might not make it back, Sarah said, her eyes welling. He wrote to me, to Lily, telling us how much he loved us. But it's the last part, the part I've never understood. Her hand trembled as she unfolded the paper. Jackson braced himself. He could hear the whine of incoming rounds, the frantic shouts, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. The past was no longer a memory. It was a presence in the room, thick and suffocating. He wrote. Sarah's voice cracked. If you're reading this, it means I wasn't strong enough. Tell our little girl her daddy loves her. And tell her I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough. She looked up at Jackson, her face a canvas of raw, unanswered grief. Why would he write that, Colonel? What happened out there that made him believe he was a coward? Jackson's composure finally shattered. The words, not brave enough, were a direct quote, a piece of a conversation he had replayed in his mind 1,000,000 times. It wasn't a confession of cowardice. It was a premonition of sacrifice. The worn, creased paper in Sarah Thorne's hands was a trigger. As she spoke her husband's last words, the walls of the cabin dissolved, replaced by the sun-baked rock and choking dust of the Korangal Valley. The memory crashed over Jackson not as a series of images, but as a full sensory assault. Afghanistan, 2004. He was Captain Davies then, younger, harder, convinced of his own invincibility. They were on a reconnaissance patrol, moving through a narrow gorge the locals called the Grinder. The heat was a physical weight, the silence of the surrounding cliffs unnatural, ominous. Sergeant Michael Thorne was near the front of the column, his M4 held at a low ready. Thorne wasn't a loud man, not a backslapping, soldier. He was quiet, thoughtful, a man who carried pictures of his wife and a baby daughter he'd only held for 2 weeks. The night before, sitting on ammo crates under a sky littered with 1,000,000,000 stars, Thorne had spoken to him. Captain, he'd said, his voice low. If something happens, if I get a choice, I'm not sure I'll be brave enough to do what's right. Davies had clapped him on the shoulder. You're a good soldier, Sergeant. You'll do your duty. Now, standing in his cabin, Jackson understood the terrible, prophetic weight of that conversation. Thorne hadn't been talking about running. He'd been talking about running towards the danger. The ambush came with a sudden, violent fury that defied comprehension. The crack of incoming fire echoed off the canyon walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the enemy's location. Men yelled, dirt kicked up by bullets stung their faces, and the air filled with the acrid smell of cordite. In the memory, Jackson saw himself, frozen for a half-second, his mind struggling to process the chaos. And then he saw Thorne. The official report said Thorne had taken cover and failed to return fire. That was the lie. The truth was that Thorne had done the opposite. He had immediately laid down a base of fire, giving the other men precious seconds to find cover. He was a rock in the middle of a hurricane. Then came the whistle, a sound that cut through the cacophony of the firefight, a sound that every soldier dreads. An RPG, followed by the sickening thud of a grenade landing in their midst. It rolled to a stop in the small, rocky depression where 3 young privates were huddled, paralyzed by fear. Back in the cabin, Jackson flinched, his hand instinctively going to his side. The scent of wood smoke was gone, replaced by the smell of blood and hot metal. He was no longer in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He was back in the grinder, watching a single, terrible moment unspool in agonizing slow motion. "Was my daddy a coward, sir?" The question came not from Sarah, but from the little girl. Lily Thorne had been silent until now, a small, solemn observer. But her voice, clear and pure and utterly devoid of judgment, was more piercing than any bullet. It sliced through the fog of Jackson's memory and nailed him to the present. He looked down at her. She wasn't a soldier's daughter demanding answers. She was just a child who needed to know if her father, the man she only knew from faded photographs and a mother's stories, was worthy of her love. Her question was the final blow against his crumbling fortress. For 20 years, he had justified his lie. He had told himself it was for the good of the unit, to protect morale. After the ambush, the platoon was shattered. They had lost good men. The survivors were hollowed out, their confidence gone. The official story was that Captain Davies, their leader, had heroically smothered the grenade, while Sergeant Thorne, sadly, had faltered under pressure. It was a neat, clean narrative. It gave the men a hero to rally around, a myth to salvage from the wreckage of a disastrous engagement. It earned him a promotion, a medal, and a nickname, Stonewall, for his supposed unshakable nerve. He had accepted it, telling himself it was the burden of command. He was protecting Thorne's family from a more complicated, messy truth. But looking at the pain in Sarah's face and the innocent plea in Lily's eyes, he saw his justification for what it was, a coward's excuse. He hadn't protected them. He had cursed them. He had sentenced them to 2 decades of shame and doubt, while he hid in the mountains, suffocating under the weight of an honor he had never earned. He had stolen Michael Thorne's name, his courage, his legacy. The irony was devastating. In an attempt to create a hero for his unit, he had become the very thing the official report accused Michael Thorne of being. A coward. His silence was the real failure of duty. Lily's question hung in the air, demanding an answer. He could repeat the lie one last time. He could send them away with a hollow platitude about the fog of war. He could preserve his legend and retreat back into his gilded cage. Or he could do what he should have done 20 years ago, in front of the first debriefing officer. He could tell the truth. The internal battle was brief but violent. 2 decades of habit, of disciplined silence, fought against the rising tide of confession. He paced the floor, his heavy boots thudding on the old wood planks, the sound like a judge's gavel. He looked at the Medal of Honor, its golden points of light seeming to mock him. It was a beautiful lie, polished and perfect. Then he looked at Lily. Her face was a portrait of fragile hope, a mirror of the daughter Michael Thorne never got to see grow up. He saw Michael's eyes in hers, and in that moment, the soldier's promise he'd made to a dead man's memory, the promise to carry the lie, was finally broken by a father's debt to a living child. He stopped pacing and turned to face them. The stone mask was gone, replaced by a raw, agonizing vulnerability. The women saw not a colonel, not a hero, but a broken man on the verge of shattering. "No," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "No, sweetheart. Your father was not a coward." The words came out, and it felt like a physical weight was being lifted from his chest, a pressure he hadn't even realized he was carrying until it was gone. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first clean breath he'd taken in 20 years. "The official report, everything you were told, it was a lie," Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Lily's eyes widened, a flicker of understanding dawning in their depths. Jackson's gaze met Sarah's, and for the first time, he spoke not as an officer reciting a report, but as a man giving a final testimony. "I was the one who lied," he confessed, the words tearing from him. "I lied to the debriefing officers. I lied to the investigators. I lied to the president when he put this medal around my neck. I've been lying ever since. He gestured around the empty cabin, at the isolation, the Spartan existence. This isn't a hero's retirement. This is a prison. And I was my own jailer. He walked back to his armchair but didn't sit. He leaned on it, his knuckles white, as if needing its support to finally stand upright under the weight of the truth. You want to know what happened in that valley? You want to know who your husband, who your father really was? I'll tell you. I'll tell you everything. There was no time to think. Jackson began, his voice dropping to a near whisper, drawing them back with him into the crucible of that day. The grenade landed right in the middle of us. It was a pineapple, an old Soviet F-1. You'd get 3, maybe 4 seconds. For a full second, everyone just stared at it. Frozen. We were all going to die. He looked directly at Lily. I was the officer in command. It was my job to act. My duty. And for that 1 second. I hesitated. The admission hung in the air, heavy and damning. I was thinking about my own life. My career. Everything I hadn't done yet. I hesitated, his eyes shifted, looking past them now, seeing the scene with perfect, horrifying clarity. But your father. Michael, he didn't. He didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. The narrative slowed, each detail rendered with cinematic precision. He was providing cover fire from a few feet away. He saw the grenade. He saw the faces of the 3 young privates who were about to be torn apart. He saw me, his captain, frozen in place. And he made a choice. Jackson's voice was strained, as if he were reliving the physical exertion of the moment. He didn't shout a warning. There was no time. He just moved. He dropped his rifle, took 2 quick steps, and he dove. He dove right on top of it, pulling it into his chest, into his gut. He curled his own hands over his stomach, an unconscious echo of the action. He wrapped his body around it. He made himself a shield. His last act on this earth was to absorb the entire blast, to take every piece of shrapnel that was meant for us. The cabin was utterly silent, save for Jackson's ragged breathing. Sarah was openly weeping, but her tears were no longer just for her loss, they were for her husband's unimaginable courage. We were showered in dust and rock. Jackson continued. The ringing in my ears was deafening. But we were alive. All of us. Because of him. He saved my life. He saved everyone's life. He finally sank into the armchair, the story draining the last of his strength. When the dust settled, the battle was still raging, but the immediate crisis was over. I was the senior officer. I was the one who wrote the initial field report. And I was a coward. Not in the firefight, but in the aftermath. I looked at my shattered platoon, and I made a command decision. I told them we needed a hero to hold on to, a victory. I told them the official story would be that I jumped on the grenade. I told them it was to protect the honor of the unit. The truth is, I was protecting myself. I couldn't live with the fact that a quiet sergeant had been braver than I was. So I took his action. I took his courage. I took his honor. And I let them call him a coward. A profound, sacred silence filled the room. The truth, now fully exposed, seemed to alter the very quality of the light, making the dusty air clearer, the shadows less menacing. Sarah Thorne looked at the man who had just dismantled his own legend, and she felt not anger, but a wave of complex, wrenching pity. He had lived in a hell of his own making for 20 years, guarding a tomb that contained her husband's honor. Lily had slid closer to her mother, her small hand finding Sarah's. The word coward was gone from her mind, replaced by the image her father diving, a human shield, a guardian. The story had not just given her a father, it had given her a giant. Her quiet tears were not of sorrow, but of a fierce, burning pride that finally had a place to land. She finally understood the letter. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough. He hadn't been apologizing for his fear. He had been apologizing to them, his family, for the choice he knew he would have to make. He was sorry he wouldn't be brave enough to walk away from his duty to his men, even if it meant leaving his family behind. It was the ultimate soldier's apology, a statement of profound, selfless love. Jackson watched their faces, his own expression stripped of all pretense. He was awaiting their judgment, ready to accept any condemnation they might cast upon him. But there was none. There was only a shared, devastating understanding of the cost of war and the crushing weight of its aftermath. Sarah finally found her voice, shaky but clear. "Thank you," she whispered. The two words were a balm, an absolution Jackson had never expected and felt he didn't deserve. "Thank you for telling us the truth." He could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He felt a sense of release so total it left him dizzy. The ghosts of the Karangal Valley were not gone, but for the first time, they were quiet. The lie had been the chain that bound them to him. The truth had set them all free. With movements that were slow and deliberate, as if performing a long-rehearsed ritual, Jackson Davies rose from his chair. He walked to the stone mantelpiece, his eyes fixed on the Medal of Honor. For 20 years, it had been an object of shame, a glittering monument to his deceit. Now, it was something else entirely. It was a debt to be paid. His fingers, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of soldiering, closed around the cool metal of the star and the silken fabric of the blue ribbon. He lifted it from its stand. The absence of its weight on the mantel was immediate, a tangible void in the room's focal point. He turned, the medal resting in his open palm. He walked towards Sarah and Lily, not as a colonel, but as a penitent. He knelt. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to the image of the stoic hero, that it took Sarah's breath away. He knelt before the child, bringing himself to her level, his eyes meeting hers. "This was never mine to keep," he said, his voice imbued with a new, quiet authority, the authority of truth. "Every honor, every accolade I've ever received for that day belongs to your father. This medal is awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty that was Sergeant Michael Thorne. He didn't just answer the call of duty, he embodied it." He held it out to Lily. "This belongs to him. Which means it belongs to you." He didn't just hand it to her. He took the ribbon and, with gentle reverence, he placed it around her neck. The deep blue fabric settled against the collar of her simple cotton shirt, the gold star resting over her heart. It was far too large for her, a symbol of a man's ultimate sacrifice now worn by the child for whom he had made it. "When people ask you about your father," Jackson said, his gaze unwavering, "you tell them this story. You tell them he was the bravest man I ever knew." The weight of the medal settled onto Lily's small frame, its significance far heavier than its physical mass. She reached down, and her small fingers traced the star's outline, a tangible link to the father she had never known. The cold metal seemed to warm under her touch. For the first time in his adult life, Jackson Davies felt a sense of peace. The storm inside him had finally broken. The future was a blank page. The world would learn the truth. He would make sure of it. His reputation would be ruined, his name disgraced. He would be stripped of his rank, his pension, his place in the history books. He would be known not as Stonewall Davies, the Lion of Karangal, but as the man who stole a hero's honor. And he welcomed it. It was a small price to pay for his soul. Sarah helped Lily to her feet. The mother and daughter stood before him, their grief now transformed into a legacy of courage. There were no more words to be said. Sarah simply placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of forgiveness, of closure, of a shared and terrible burden finally laid to rest. They left as quietly as they had arrived. Jackson stood on his porch and watched the sedan navigate the winding gravel road, carrying away the truth he had guarded for so long. It was no longer his to keep. He watched until the car was just a speck, disappearing into the vast, silent mountains. He remained standing there long after it was gone, breathing the clean, cold air. The fire in his hearth was still out, but for the first time in 20 years, the chill was gone from his bones. In the valley below, a little girl sat in the back of a car, a medal of honor resting against her heart, her father's love and courage finally, truly, Home.